2020, overall hate crimes decreased by 7%, but those targeting Asian Americans rose by nearly 150%. Pew Research Center has found that 4 in 10 adults say that racist views have been expressed towards Asians since the pandemic began. Between March 19, 2020 and February 28, 2021, California-based Stop AAPI Hate's reporting center recorded 3,795 discriminatory incidents. According to the report released on March 16, 2021, women reported incidents of assault 2.3 times more than men. Adults ranging from the ages of 26 to 35 reported 31% of the total incidents, while seniors 60 years and older report 6.2% of the total incidents. 11.1% were of physical assault. Trump's scapegoating phrases such as Kung Flu and Chinese virus has held a considerably damaging effect on the Chinese population. Koreans are the second most discriminated group. The majority of the discrimination is happening in businesses and public areas. Even though the media widely publicizes physical harassments, they make up just 11.1% of the types of discrimination. Verbal harassments and name-calling are the most common. These incidents aren't just numbers. This is our reality.
Hate crimes against Asian Americans are on the rise.
Knocked to the ground and berated with racial slurs and threats.
Taunting marchers and screaming racial epithets.
Push Ma to the ground before repeatedly stomping on his head.
A brutal attack on an Asian couple.
Says she was attacked unprovoked. Of attacking an Asian woman.
Attacking a Chinese woman.
In an unprovoked attack.
Attacked in Hell's Kitchen.
He was attacked.
I have been discriminated against and experienced attempted assault.
I have been publicly harassed.
I have been discriminated against.
I have been discriminated against.
I have been harassed.
I have been verbally harassed.
Due to my racial identity.
Enough is enough.
I stand with the Stony Brook Asian American and Pacific Islander community.
I stand with the AAPI community at Stony Brook.
I stand with the Stony Brook AAPI community.
I stand with the Stony Brook AAPI community.
I stand with the AAPI community.
I stand with the Stony Brook AAPI community.
I stand against Asian and Asian American hate.
And I advocate against Asian racism.
This hate has to stop.
We must stop acts of hate, injustice, and ignorance directed at Asian Americans or anyone else on the basis of the color of their skin.
Hate has no place in our society.
I hate racism.
Stop Asian hate.
End all hate crimes.
End all hate crime.
End all hate crimes.
I stand with people of Asian descent and Indigenous Pacific Islander descent at Stony Brook and in North America to end discrimination, assault, and injustice against Black and Indigenous peoples and all people of color.
Earlier this year, SurveyMonkey asked people if they have ever been asked where they are from, assuming that they are not from the US. Asian Americans were the group that was asked this question the most.
I am Korean American.
I'm Chinese American.
I am Korean American.
I am Vietnamese American.
I'm Chinese American.
I am a Korean American.
I am a Filipino Hispanic American.
I am Chinese American.
I am an Italian Dutch American.
I am a Korean American.
I am Chinese American.
As a Trinidadian Puerto Rican American.
I am Chinese American.
Welcome everyone. Today we come together to celebrate the Asian American, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. More importantly, we stand in solidarity with each other to put forth our strongest voice against racism and hate of all forms. So thank you for joining us. Let the forum begin. I introduce to you our MC, Dr. Agnes He.
Welcome to the public forum on anti-AAPI racism. Presented by Stony Brook University's Department of Asian and Asian American Studies, the Center for Korean Studies, the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, Japan Center at Stony Brook, and the Gatteau Center for India Studies. This event is co-sponsored by Asian American Bridge Center, Center for Changing Systems of Power, College of Arts and Sciences, the Wong Center, the Institute for Globalization Studies, Office of the Dean of Students, and the Office of Multicultural Affairs. As we have seen, that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are facing a historical crisis. Acts of violence, harassment, and xenophobia against members of the AAPI community have escalated as Asians and Asian Americans have been blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, we're here to address the roots of the violence, discrimination, and xenophobia, to share our experiences, to create anti-racist alliance, to explore ways to make positive social change. Our forum today is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, university administrators and elected public officers will share with us their thoughts. In the second part, which will be about for 45 minutes, we will hear from a group of faculty and students as they are engaged in the focused discussion. For the last 20 to 25 minutes, we will have an open discussion in which the audience will be invited to participate. Now, some housekeeping rules. This forum is being recorded. During the forum, please put your microphone on mute. If you have a question or comment before the open discussion, please feel free to use the chat box and send it to Eva Nagase questions. We will be monitoring the chat box during the forum and share as many questions and comments as possible in the end. Now, let's get started. It is my great honor to invite the president of Stony Brook University, Dr. Maurie McInnis, to be our first speaker. President McInnis, please.
Hello, and thank you for having me here today. It is a privilege and an honor to be celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month this May. I know that it is incredibly important that we take the time, not just this month, but year-round, to talk about the pressures and prejudices that the AAPI community faces, and importantly, how we at Stony Brook University can respond to and support our colleagues and friends. Thank you to the Asian and Asian American Studies Department, the Center for India Studies, the Center for Korean Studies, the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, and the Japan Center at Stony Brook for presenting this event. Thank you also to Senator John Leo for joining us today. Stony Brook University prides itself on being a diverse institution and knows that this diversity is integrally related to creativity, forward-thinking research, and transformational healthcare. We know our diversity is vital to the success of our mission. And with this knowledge, it is important that we continue to cultivate an atmosphere of tolerance, inquiry, acceptance, and celebration of difference. We must continue our efforts in promoting equity and inclusivity across campus and a just learning environment for all. The AAPI community has greatly contributed to our development as a top research institution and role model in innovation. Our research, education, and service would not be the same without Asian American and Pacific Islander sea wolves. This past fall, the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies' own Chi-Wan Huang Erica Sato and Agnes Hay, who graciously coordinated this event today, were selected for funding by the US Department of Education for their multi-year project, The Impact of Intercultural Engagement on Asian Language Learning Outcomes. Their work shows the kind of layered research that makes Stony Brook's pedagogy so dynamic, rigorous, and renowned. Just last week, our Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication hosted Dr. Suresh Kanjiwaraja of Pennsylvania State University as part of its distinguished lecture series, demonstrating how our AAPI scholars continually reach across campus, across the country, and across the world to forge connections and engage new perspectives. Our AAPI scholars have helped create the tradition of discovery that makes our university what it is today. Our AAPI students are part of the next generation of leaders and thinkers. We at Stony Brook have deeply felt the fear, distrust, anger, and grief caused by the recent surge in anti-Asian violence and prejudice in our country. These acts of ignorance and hate are antithetical to our values as a university. And although our collective dialogue may be dealing with these issues right now, such prejudices are not new. We at Stony Brook are committed to ensuring that this university is always a place where the members of our AAPI community are supported, protected, listened to, and valued. I take very seriously our university's efforts to support the research and scholarship of those in our AAPI community, and to encourage and learn from those projects dealing specifically with AAPI issues and experiences then and now. I take seriously higher education's role in thoughtfully engaging with our history as a country and a world, and in actively dismantling the systemic racism and prejudice that has plagued us for too long. And I also take seriously my task to listen and learn at events like this one, Breaking Silence, a public forum on anti-AAPI racism, and to understand how our institution can best provide an inclusive, dynamic, and equitable education for years to come. Thank you for organizing this great event with all of these wonderful speakers.
Thank you, President McInnis, for your encouraging words and for your strong leadership. Next, I would like to invite our Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Judy Brown-Clarke, to share her thoughts. Dr. Clarke.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so humbled and honored to welcome you this afternoon. Racism against Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders are not a new phenomenon, particularly to those who have experienced it. But a recent rise in violent crimes has ignited and triggered deep-rooted fears and has drawn national attention. Now members of our AAPI community and us as allies are calling for people to educate themselves and end the hate. In terms of how do you stop it, we need to understand how we got here, its evolution, and the historical precedents for this surge. We need to educate ourselves on the history of violence and what racist acts are, what microaggressions are, how to speak up and out, how to help, and how to take definitive actions. I am proud to say that Stony Brook has a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee in every single college and unit across Stony Brook across the Stony Brook campus. That's important because those allies and structures are going to put in place the recommendations that come from your discussions through this process. And it allows us to make some very targeted and put together some solutions that we absolutely make sure that Stony Brook reflects the foundation of why we are here today. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to each of you for attending today, for your collective effort to work together and a strong, compassionate, and empowered voice. Please enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. I would now like to invite our Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students, Dr. Richard Gatteau, to present his remarks.
Thanks so much, Agnes. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to say a few words. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to focus my remarks today specifically on our AAPI student community. This year, obviously, because of COVID, we have many of our students studying in person, but I want to give greetings also to all of our AAPI students who are studying remotely across the globe. And a moment like this is so important because it's an opportunity for all of us to stay connected to this very special place we call Stony Brook. As you saw in the video that was shown when we started this afternoon, it's very obvious to see the increase in anti-Asian hate and violence across our country. And it's been horrific in innocent lives being lost and seeing the uptick in Asian targeted hate crimes. But as members of our Stony Brook campus community, it's clear we must all work together to build a safer and more equitable society. And we know that our communities experience so many emotions, sadness, anger, and fear. And let's take those emotions and put them into words and actions to become even more inclusive as a campus community. At Stony Brook, I think some of our values has already been addressed. We are an educational institution. We want to educate ourselves, educate others, encourage dialogue. We are a community who embraces difference. We build allies and we spread peace, and not only at our campus, but across the world. And so today, as we do every day, we all stand in solidarity and support with our AAPI community of faculty, staff, and students. We are all Seawolves, and we will not allow hate to divide our community. It's so important that we value each person in our community as a human being and focus on the importance of treating others with respect, dignity, and care. And so again, to our AAPI student community, I know you come from all parts of the world, which just makes Stony Brook the most incredible university in the world. And I want you to know too that our student affairs team is committed to supporting you. We have so many in-person and virtual resources of support. Our student support team, our CAPS team, our Office of Multicultural Affairs, our Center for Prevention and Outreach, and so many more areas that are here to support you. So let's stay connected, whether it's remote or in person during this time, so that we can continue to be partners in your success. So again, even today, as we grieve the loss of innocent lives and the pain of bias and discrimination and fear among our AAPI community, let us all continue to do our important work at Stony Brook to create a more civil and humane world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gatteau. Now, please join me in welcoming the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Nicole Sampson. Dean Sampson.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very important public forum. I'm deeply saddened and concerned by the drastic surge in anti-AAPI hate and violence that's affecting so many people in our community. And as a Caucasian blonde woman in America, I've become very aware of my own privilege when I hear the stories and feel the pain of my Asian American, and Pacific Islander colleagues who are students, faculty, and staff. No one should be an object for targeting or abuse simply on the basis of their color, the color of their skin or their hair. The research and education of the entities like those represented here today, as well as many other departments across the university, are so critical to improving our environment for everyone. And I want to thank these departments and centers for the pivotal support that they provide to our AAPI students and faculty. In the College of Arts and Sciences, we are more committed than ever to supporting our AAPI community by addressing the deep-seated racism that we've heard about in the opening of this forum, discrimination and violence that have plagued our communities and that create inequalities with consequences that occur on a global scale, as we have currently been witnessing. We're dedicated to educating our students, faculty, and staff so they may better understand how we're all interconnected through both our political and social systems, and how to take constructive actions as responsible citizens of the world to lead further positive change in our society on and off campus. And in the college, we completely and wholeheartedly support the university's plan for equity, inclusion, and diversity that's created to enhance our campus community and to continue to address the persistent issues of inequality in our society. We recognize and respect the cultural backgrounds of all students, faculty, staff, and members of the greater community. So in that guise, we will continue to support the important work that's being done in our departments and centers to create a climate where AAPI students, faculty, and staff feel safe from harm as an integral part of the campus community, and as they pursue their programs of study and research, and as they build current and future careers. We will continue our efforts to provide our students with the best education possible, one that expands their global knowledge and enriches their Stony Brook and Seawolf experience through compassionate and innovative programming, academic planning, and cultural exchange. I'd like to thank E.K. Tan, Chair of the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies, and Agnes Hood, Director of the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, for putting this forum together today, inviting me and everyone else involved in coordinating today's event. I stand with the Stony Brook AAPI community.
Thank you, Dean Sampson, for your continued support, inspiration, and leadership. We are very honored today to have with us New York State Senator John Liu. Senator John Liu represents a broad area of Northeast Queens. He is chairperson of the Senate's Committee on New York City Education and also serves on the committees of Budget and Revenue, Education, Finance, Higher Education, Rules, and Transportation. He is the first Asian American to win legislative office in New York and the first to win citywide office. Senator Liu, please.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for that kind introduction. I'm so delighted to join our Stony Brook family on this very special occasion. As we know, this past year plus has really been devastating. It's number one devastating because everybody's been suffering through this global pandemic that none of us have ever seen the likes of which before. And it's been said many times already. I've said it myself. The Asian American community has faced a secondary virus, one that up to now still has no vaccine, still has no cure, and that is the virus of hate and bigotry. We've seen countless incidents where people either make stupid comments or gestures to violently attacking people, many senior citizens, and the killing spree in Atlanta, which was clearly targeted against Asian Americans. All of this clearly correlated to the pandemic and the scapegoating of Asian Americans for this virus, in no small part because of the rhetoric of some of the leadership in Washington at the time, including the former president, who incessantly, despite the urging of community leaders and public health professionals, incessantly called COVID-19 the China virus or the Kung flu, both of which are now anti-Asian slurs in modern day lexicon. This has been an incredibly difficult time. And as was mentioned earlier, the racism that Asian Americans have felt is not new. It's certainly not new. And this is why it's so important to have this kind of discussion, because I do believe that, anti-Asian bias incidents and hate crimes, they are crimes and they do need law enforcement response, but it can't end at that. It has to be a much more long-term endeavor to eradicate this kind of bias and fear. And the only way to do that is to recognize the root causes of discrimination and hate, and that is ignorance and fear. Fear because millions of people around the world have died, and people need some kind of answer, or in the absence of an answer, someone to blame. And the ignorance that continues to exist about Asian Americans, who we are, what our experience has been. Are we, are we the model minority that always does well in school and makes a lot of money and doesn't need help from everybody? And in fact, all other minority communities should try to emulate, which is ridiculous. Or are we this perpetual foreigner? People who, they're not really American. How many times have we been asked, where are you from? And when I say I'm from Flushing, there's always an immediate answer, a follow-up question that they ask, no, where are you really from? As if they can't accept Flushing or Long Island or New York or the United States as an answer for someone who appears to be Asian, even though we've been here most of our lives, or in many cases now for generations been born here. So the perpetual foreigner syndrome is something that we continue to suffer through. I have proposed in the state legislature that beyond increasing hate crimes penalties and law enforcement responses, getting more undercover cops out there, we need to do something along the lines of education and to ensure that Asian American history, which is part of American history, is at least somewhat reflected in the textbooks that the students of New York and beyond use on a regular basis. When I was in high school, one paragraph of Asian American history, that was about the completion of the railroads. I mean, there's so much more than that. To this day, people don't know who Vincent Chin was and what the significance of his killing was. And people don't know about the scapegoating of South Asians in the aftermath of 9/11. People also don't even know the prison camps that this country set up during World War II to capture all the enemies of state, supposed enemies of state, Japanese Americans at the time. And so there's a lot that we all have to learn. There's a lot that all Americans, not just AAPIs, have to learn. So I think it's great that Stony Brook is putting this safe space together for everybody to share their experiences. And I know we're hearing from faculty and students. I really encourage you to just talk specifically about an experience that you may have had as an Asian American that helps to raise the awareness and make everybody else aware and educated about what the Asian American experience is. So thank you, Agnes, for the introduction. I want to thank Dr. Tan for his leadership. It is specifically what we are facing with right now that raises the need for departments all throughout universities in this country, and especially here at Stony Brook, the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies. We need to understand this experience so that we can break the cycle of ignorance and fear and bigotry that we continue to face. And then finally, shout out to Jeremy Wang for inviting me to today's special event. Thank you all. Enjoy this event today. Make use of it. And remember, it's not just today. The entire month of May is APA Heritage Month. And don't just stop at May. Continue talking about your experiences, reporting things if you see things that make you feel uncomfortable, and be proud. We are proud Asian Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Liu, for your support and for your leadership. We now move on to the second part of our forum, which is a faculty and student discussion group. This part will be moderated by Dr. E.K. Tan, Chair of the Department of Asian American Studies, and Dr. Rosabelle Ansari, Lecturer in the Department of Asian American Studies. So E.K. and Rosie, the floor is yours.
I'm glad to be here with Rosie, Dr. Ansari, to moderate this session. For this session, we have a total of 8 panelists. 6 of them are here with us live. We will begin by sharing 2 short video recordings. The first video is from our very own faculty, Dr. Nerissa Balce, from the Asian and Asian American Studies. And the second video that you will see is from Dr. Gary Ma from the Department of Philosophy. They're not here with us today, but they are sharing their thoughts and experience with us through the videos. So enjoy.
Hello, everyone. I want to greet all of you who are supporting our department's event Breaking Silence, a public forum on anti-Asian racism. I'm Nerissa Balce. I teach courses on Asian American Studies at Stony Brook. I wanted to begin by saying that racism is a structural violence, a violence so deeply embedded in the American imagination, as well as the myths of this nation. After all, a country founded on native dispossession, genocide, and slavery will forever be haunted by its past. So in my courses that I teach here at Stony Brook, I like to emphasize that Asian immigrants, as well as Asian Americans, have always fought against racism. We actually have never been silent. For example, on April 30, Japanese-American filmmaker Rene Tajima Peña, director of many documentaries that include Who Killed Vincent Chin, as well as the recent docuseries Asian Americans that we saw last year. She tweeted this and she said, quote, "Asian Americans have a long, long history of speaking out and taking action. Just because you didn't learn it in school or the press didn't cover it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen," end quote. So this is a powerful and important idea for us to remember, even as we grieve for those who have been violently attacked and killed by racists. We have never been silent. There is, for example, the life of author, activist, and feminist philosopher Grace Lee Boggs, who actively campaigned for civil rights and workers' issues for 70 years of her life until her death in 2015 at the age of 100. And this is a beautiful photo of a young Grace Lee with her husband, James Boggs, a Black auto worker and a radical thinker and writer. In Detroit, Michigan, she founded food cooperatives and community groups to support the elderly and organized unemployed workers. There is also the life of Yuri Kochiyama, who lived in the Japanese-American internment camps during World War II. After the war, Yuri married Bill Kochiyama and they moved to New York City. In their home in the Harlem projects, she organized with her Black and Puerto Rican neighbors. And in the early 60s, she became close to a young philosopher and activist named Malcolm X. And this photo we see of Yuri is a famous photograph from Life magazine. Yuri is cradling Malcolm's head after he was shot. So to conclude, Filipino American women activists continue this struggle that was began by activists like Grace as well as Yuri. This photo shows a young Filipina in a protest in California for the Black Lives Matter movement last spring. And this last photo is a photograph taken just a few days ago during the Mayo Uno or the May 1 or the Labor Day protests in New York City. As these photos show, we have never been silent and we have always fought for justice. Thank you.
Why has there been a 150% increase in violence against Asian Americans? Part of the reason is that they're absent from history. What needs to be done is to know the stories of these people, and this is a story about my father. My father joined the Air Force when he was young. When World War II happened, he had his father sign a form so that he could become a cadet. And although he was too young to volunteer, and he flew 35 missions over Nazi Germany. Standard tour of duty was 25 missions. And the thing that he liked the most about it was not the medals, wasn't a showboat. It was this certificate was called the Lucky Bastards Club. It said on the 25th day of October 1942, the fickle finger of fate finds it expedient to trace on the roll of the Lucky Bastard Club the name of John W. Marr, bombardier on the Flying Fortress Little 8 Ball, for having this day achieved the remarkable record of sailing forth and returning no less than 35 times, for having braved the hazards of Hun flak, for bringing to Hitler and his cronies tons of bombs, for bending the Luftwaffe back, all through the courtesy of the 8th Air Force, who sponsors these programs in the interests of freedom-loving people everywhere. My dad met my mom at a USO in Big Springs, Texas. My mom was cleaning carburetors, and they met, they fell in love. He flew his 35 missions, and when he came back, they got married. They started the first Chinese takeout restaurant in Sacramento. He took out the back seat of a car, and the muffler boiled the water and kept the chow man warm. But he wanted to go back on the GI Bill and become an architect because he had bombed so many buildings in Germany. He wanted to build buildings. And when I had this idea for an Asian American Center at Stony Brook, I asked my dad to draw the plans. He came out and he drew the plans. And those plans were given to Charles Wang. And because of my dad, Charles Wang decided to build the Asian American Center at Stony Brook so that the history of Asian Americans can be something that's known and important for this university. My dad died 17 years ago on January 6th, and because of the way this country has become, my mother can't go to the store without a target on her back because of the ignorance of Asian American history, of what people like my father did to make it so that she would be able to live and to be able to go to the store and to be a person of significance in this country.
Thank you for those videos. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Janis Mimura, Associate Professor in the Department of History.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to participate and say a few words for this forum. As a second-generation Japanese American growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, I was subjected to a good amount of racial taunts and slurs by other children. I try not to let it get to me. My sister was a little older, would come home crying though, and my father would say, "You can do better. Don't get so emotional." My parents were devoted to music. They hoped that one of us would become a musician because they said that in music, there is no racial prejudice. I ended up becoming an historian of Japan instead, where I grapple with state-sanctioned racism in many aspects of my research. Japan's relationship with the Axis, with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. The recent Asian hate crimes are part of a long history of anti-Asian violence and discrimination in the US going back to the 19th century. Let's not forget America was colonial powers. It forced open Japan with gunboats. 1853, it annexed Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam, and it exploited a weak China under the name of so-called open door policy, which provided free. And from that time, Asians have been scapegoated in the US, especially during periods of national duress. Chinese and Japanese immigrants have been accused of stealing jobs in the land of white Americans, culminating in a series of racist Inclusion Act, the 1924 Immigration Act, which essentially banned Asian immigration, and the 1913 California Alien Land Act that banned Japanese possession and leasing of property more than 3 years. During World War II, about 120,000 Japanese Americans, of which about 2/3 were US citizens, were forced into internment camps on the West Coast. Now, neither Germans nor Italians were racially targeted in the US or placed in camps. The Americans distinguished between good Germans and Nazis. But in the case of the Japanese, they were all enemies. From a historical perspective, the recent anti-Asian incidents sadly repeat the same patterns of scapegoating, victimization, and violence in the US. And I just ended here to say that we can do better. America needs to do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mimura. Next, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Crystal Fleming. She's professor in the Department of Sociology. She's also affiliated faculty in the Department of Africana Studies. Dr. Fleming.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to join you all today. I teach classes on racism and ethnic relations at Stony Brook, and every year, if not every semester, if I'm teaching the course, we certainly address the very long history of anti-Asian racism in this country. As a Black woman, I stand in solidarity with the AAPI community at Stony Brook and beyond. I stand with all people who are committed to challenging and dismantling systemic racism. And I think that everything that we have heard so far has really made prominent the role of history in understanding what we're seeing in our society today with the horrific rise of anti-Asian hate crimes from coast to coast, in which we've seen perpetrators who are from just about every background. So I do want to say, though, I think someone needs to be muted. So if we could make sure microphones are muted. So we see people from a wide range of ethnic and racial backgrounds participating as perpetrators in these hate crimes, which underscores, again, that what we're dealing with is a collective problem and a systemic one. In New York City, where I live, we see horrific headlines about Asian people being targeted. And just this week in San Francisco, there were 2 elderly Asian American women who were stabbed, again, in the middle of San Francisco. But that is not new. We have only, again, to look at history. In Los Angeles, there was a massacre of Chinese people in 1871 that resulted in the murder of 10% of the population of Chinese people in LA. And around that same era, we had racist ideology, white supremacist ideology, xenophobia, targeting directly Asian people in politics, in media, in newspapers, and very much embedded in our culture. And so I think one of the main things I want to convey is that absolutely we're dealing with a problem of ignorance. We are dealing with hatred and fear, but that ignorance and that fear was constructed by design. That is a part of the system of racism. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood and wrote that the ideology of white supremacy was embedded in our country in nearly every textbook. And he also wrote that it was preached from practically every pulpit, and that in his words, white supremacy became a structured part of our culture. So we have a collective responsibility as community members at Stony Brook, a public educational institution, to name this history and its ongoing realities. We have a collective responsibility for speaking up and breaking the silence around anti-Asian racism, but also the silence around the realities of systemic racism and white supremacy in our society. Our campus must take hate crimes far more seriously than it does currently. There are far too many instances of people being targeted on our campus and beyond, and it not being acknowledged when it happens. So we need to break that silence as well. And in addition to education and the important courses and programming that we have at Stony Brook, we need resistance. Beyond dialogue, we need resistance. And you've been seeing and hearing that this resistance has a long history and it's not new. But part of what we need to do as our community is to affirm the value of resistance and organizing and protest. And we have that responsibility to not just stand up when we are targeted, but again, to stand in interracial and intergroup solidarity and compassion with each other, no matter who is targeted. So again, thank you for the honor of joining you today. And I am honored to stand in resistance and protest with you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming, for that poignant talk. I'd like to now introduce Associate Professor Laurie Flores from the Department of History.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to see you all here, and I'm honored, just like Professor Fleming said, to be amongst you. I identify as an ally from the Latinx community, and I'm a historian, and I wanted to reinforce how important it is for us all to acknowledge anti-AAPI racism as a historically long and deep racism that has permeated this nation's past. And I wanted to talk briefly about the ways in which this discrimination and marginalization has overlapped with treatment of the Latinx community in very noticeable ways, especially highlighted during COVID. And I'm talking about that overlap precisely because it's why we should all be standing together in protest, because these are struggles experienced by more than one community here at Stony Brook and in the United States. One of the first things we started seeing in New York City when it came to anti-Asian stereotypes and hostility at the beginning of the COVID pandemic outbreak were mocking associations, as was said before, between Asian countries and illness. The Kung flu, the Wuhan flu, the disgust with wet markets, etc. This all resulted in a declining patronage of Chinatown and its businesses and restaurants. I'm currently working on a book about the history of Latinx food workers and the devaluation of Latin American food over time. And this is what also happens, especially in the sphere of Chinese food. So that devaluation, that lack of patronage, when the exotic turns sour for people, then it becomes this unpalatable foreignness that is avoided and shunned. And marginalized and met with a lot of hostility. So the sphere of food was one of the first spheres in which we saw this hostility happen. Food and labor are two big spheres in which we have seen historically and presently this reluctance or refusal to engage and understand AAPI communities in the United States. As my colleague in history, Professor Mimura, mentioned, there has been many instances of legislation in this nation that has specifically targeted Asian communities. The very first federal immigration law that banned a group of people was the 1875 Page Act, which banned laborers who were coming to the United States for, quote, lewd or immoral purposes. And the implied association was that this contingent were Asian women who were being brought as prostitutes or coming as prostitutes. So a very early association between one's gender and one's occupation, sexual activity. The Chinese Exclusion Act is probably the most well-known act that we know of the late 19th century that did not get repealed until the 1940s, lasted for several decades. And this threat of economic competition, economic anxieties, plus ideas of difference has fueled a lot of xenophobia and racism against Asian populations in this nation. Not just the Chinese population, but as time went on, Japanese Americans and Japanese origin people banned from owning land. The Asiatic Barred Zones Act of 1917 came to ban people from the entire swath of land from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. Japanese internment, of course, a huge stain on our country. With the Korean and Vietnam Wars, that led to a lot of derogatory language crafted around these populations as the enemy. And very much like what Senator Liu was talking about, this idea of perpetual foreignness, that label is something that the Asian and Latinx communities share historically and presently. This idea that their identity cannot square with an American identity, that the two don't equate. And this is quite harmful and maddening and leads to a lot of different forms of violence, everything from language thrown out on the street to federal legislation, deportations, repatriations, detentions, and also raids, sweeps by immigration authorities, and physical beatings and attacks. Not just in places that we might expect AAPI communities are a rarity, but we are seeing, like Professor Fleming just said, these attacks happen in historically Asian cities like New York City and San Francisco. So I want to conclude by saying that I want to validate as a historian that this violence is as urgent as we think it is, as we believe it is as deep-seated as we think it is. This refrain of go back to where you came from, go back to your country, has been a historical phrase that has been used in the name of violence and exclusion and marginalization. So Asian and Latinx communities have endured these overlapping and quite similar forms of historical injustice and mistreatment. And so our allyship is just as important as ever. And I really have confidence that our generation of students with us today are going to be at the forefront of validating those intersecting struggles and fighting them together. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flores. I really appreciate the fact that you brought in this whole question of labor to talk about the overlapping relationships or overlapping experience of racism of Latinx and Asian and Asian American or AAPI community. Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Charles Robin. Dr. Robin is the director of the Center for the Changing Systems of Power. Dr. Robbins.
Thank you. On behalf of the Center for Changing Systems of Power and myself, I thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important program. We're really thrilled to co-sponsor along with so many important groups, and I'm truly honored and humbled. Violence against members of the AAPI community is not new, as we've heard. It's very much a part of the fabric of this country, but more often than not, many of us never hear about it. In the Asian American Racial Justice Toolkit, they write, and I quote, "To understand white supremacy is to understand the making of America and the dizzying array of racial myths that have been crafted and deployed about the many in service to the few. It requires questioning the belief that America's racial sins were aberrations, stains on US history that have long been overcome by progress. We must recognize that slavery and indigenous genocide were in fact the central means for forming the US nation state, and that race was the cultural folklore needed to justify them. That folklore is the outcome of political strategies that have built the cities and towns in which we live, the modern police force, the US military, the Constitution, the stock market, media, academic institutions, in short, the organization of modern American life. The economic backslide of the white working class that has steepened since the 1970s is providing fertile ground for a resurgent white nationalism, uniting people around explicit bigotry. The growing success of right-wing appeals to xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism demonstrate how central and durable white identity remains in American politics. As in eras past, the demographic changes and economic insecurity provide fertile ground for a political and cultural uprising by the white everyman seeking to stake out and defend his so-called rightful claim to America, end quote. You add to this the constant drip, drip, drip of lighter fluid that former President Trump poured on the flames of hatred and stoked against the AAPI community with the baseless claims about the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no wonder that we have seen this exponential increase in violence targeting members of the AAPI community. In a recent article, Richard Louis of NBC News wrote, and I quote, "We are done being your model minority, and we want you to listen to us about the discrimination and xenophobia and fear and pain that has colored the experiences of AAPI Americans in this country for decades, for centuries. Now is the time for a movement to protect and embrace the AAPI community." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins. I'd like to now introduce our one of our student speakers, Judy Le, who's an Asian and Asian American Studies major of the class of 2021.
Hi everyone, my name is Judy Le, and I am a Black and Asian graduating senior majoring in Asian and Asian American Studies. I would like to thank the AAS department at MIC Center for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful space. My professors who have given me the education, knowledge, and words to be able to speak here today, my parents who have given me the identity and culture as a mixed Asian American, and to the faculty who have beautifully set up this space, and to you all for joining the AAPI community today. I'm here as a mixed Asian American woman, as an Asian and Asian American Studies scholar, and as a young activist to show you all a sliver of how diverse and beautiful our AAPI community is. I hope that everyone that is here and to those watching this later on will feel solidarity despite our diversity. This event is for our South Asians, for our Pacific Islanders, for our queer Asians, for all Asians, is really what I'm getting at. I want to stress that because we are here as one whole community of AAPI and allies to find some answers, seek some refuge, and understand how big this tree has grown since the roots our ancestors have planted long ago. Although my personal experience cannot speak for all, I hope the things I share today will bring some light and understanding to the violence and racism that is deeply rooted in our American history and what we could do as a community at Stony Brook and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for sharing a perspective from a student and also a student who is extremely connected to the AAPI community, representing in one voice, right, the importance of our need for attention to the rest of the community of different kind of backgrounds. Next, we have Khadija Saad, another of our students representative. She is a political science major. She's also our representative from the SBU Muslim Students Association. Khadija.
Thank you so much. My name is Khadija Saad. I serve as president of the Muslim Student Association. I appreciate this opportunity to share a few reflections during this forum. Speaking as a Muslim and on the behalf of our community, we stand against anti-Asian American racism. To share with you our stories, as Muslims, many of our families and our ancestors immigrated to the United States for the American dream, but ended up facing the American nightmare of racism. Within the United States, while most changing opinions on a group of people happens. One example that I can share with you as a Muslim American is 9/11. After that, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States changed overnight. These everyday Muslim Americans were now othered because of misleading and harmful political messaging to society that never accepted them in the first place. We recognize that parallels surfacing again after COVID-19. The virus, albeit an international phenomenon, in some ways shares parallels with the effect of 9/11 within the United States. It is so extremely troubling to see that the blame for such a tragic phenomenon, this one even more out of the hands of humans, was placed on an entire group of people, the Asian American community. It is so irrational to blame an entire group of people for a virus. However, this connection and anti-Asian sentiment too was sparked by misleading and harmful political messaging. Racism, blame, othering, discrimination, these are not new vocabulary words. Rather, these words are descriptions intertwined with the history of America. The Asian American and Pacific Islander community have been on the short end of the American dream, American nightmare parallel. We recognize our fellow brothers and sisters' pain. We acknowledge and validate that the treatment against them is unacceptable. No group, no people, no person should be treated with violence or hate for tragedies that they have absolutely nothing to do with. Islam teaches us that the diversity of races and tribes across the world is so that we may learn about one another and appreciate our differences, not that we may see ourselves as superior or discriminate against another group of people. Likewise, these Islamic principles teach us to be compassionate and to see beyond just our own reflection, to recognize and stand with those who are oppressed and unjustly treated by society, and to have a positive role in attaining justice for them, with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Khadija. Rosie and I want to be mindful of time because we want to leave a little bit of time for discussion at the very end with all the participants. But we do have part 2 of this panel. We have a couple of questions that we want to raise and topics we want to raise. So the panelists can elaborate a little bit more about some of the questions related to their short presentations. I have a question that I want to raise here, a question about systemic racism. I do know that all the panelists had mentioned in some ways their thoughts on systemic racism and some of them, their research that's connected to systemic racism. But I do want to point to 2 areas that I'm not sure that was directly addressed. The question of how systemic racism is related to the question of inter-ethnic conflicts and also social class issue. Because Dr. Flores mentioned about the whole issue of labor and food. I'm also thinking about how racism is actually directly linked to property rights. So those kind of issues. So I wonder if any of our panelists would like to jump in and talk a little bit about the systemic racism in those 2 areas. Crystal.
Sure, I'm happy to respond to the question about systemic racism and inter-ethnic conflict. I teach every semester a great book called The Ethnic Project by sociologist Vilna Bashi-Treitler. I'm going to put it in the chat. If any of my students are here, they know this book inside and out. But it is a great primer on the relationship between the racial paradigm of white supremacy, the systemic policies and practices that have ingrained white supremacy into our culture and society, and the relationships between different ethnic groups that are racialized in the context of this society in a particular way and with a particular hierarchy. And so a short version of that book, an insight from that book, is that if you have as part of your culture, a culture of racism, a culture of valuing not just white people, but a whole gradation of even whiteness, certain types of Europeans viewed and treated better than others, people who are defined as non-white, Black people and Indigenous people occupying subordinate positions on this hierarchy, then what does that mean about assimilation? That means to assimilate into that society would be to incorporate those racist beliefs and practices, and that this is Vilna Bashi-Treitler's thesis in the Ethnic Project, to move up the hierarchy in the society, socioeconomic hierarchy, racial hierarchy, has meant to conform to the system of white supremacy. It also means that fighting it and standing up against it, even if you are a white person, standing up against white supremacy means to expose yourself to stigma and pushback and backlash, right? And any white person who has been involved in standing up against racism knows that. And if you don't know it, then you're not standing up against racism, actually, if you're not getting pushback and backlash. So so inter-ethnic conflict particularly, in regards to our nation's history, has been about, promoting acceptance into whiteness, proximity into whiteness, and racist beliefs and ideas. And, today in our society, but this is also an aspect of our culture, and I'll stop here. It came up earlier, but jokes, and kind of racist jokes and the prevalence of, denigrating, jokey ideas about racial and ethnic groups. This becomes normalized, and banter between people within and between different groups. And that reinforces a culture of dehumanization and racism. And so that's also something to acknowledge and reject and stand up against.
I didn't want to take up too much time before with continuing on with the dispossession thread that I was going on, but I'm glad that you brought up housing again and land, because those are two things that help people accumulate wealth and ownership and a feeling of belonging. And when historically we have had and put into place laws that take away people's land because they become too successful, as was the case in agricultural California when the alien land laws were passed, or with internment, where people completely either had to trust that a neighbor would look out after their property or lose it altogether, that sets people back, and that creates generational reverberations when it comes to feeling like you are settled, feeling like you can pass something on to your children, and feeling like you have some standing and some wealth to speak for in the life that you lead. So especially with COVID-19, AAPI communities have been on the front lines of not only dispensing essential services like food production and service, but healthcare in the medical realm. And the fact that they are being mistreated with everything from substandard wages to poor housing, substandard housing, evictions, a lack of tips, a lack of PPE, downright physical hostility. All of these things combined show how there are ripple effects once a threat or an association between a contingent of people and illness or disease gets fabricated and manufactured and repeated. This can have very tangible effects in people's lives, and housing and land are two of those things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flores. We're going to move on to the next question, but I want to highlight how important this question of care gets played out in two different directions. We need care at this point, but care is also exploited in some ways among the different minority groups. So Dr. Ansari, you want to take over for the next question?
Yeah, so we'd like to also move into this question of allyship. So we've heard about systemic racism as a really an American problem, right? That all sorts of groups and people of all sorts of colors and classes suffer from. We've also heard about similar experiences, right, between the AAPI community, Latinx community, Muslim community, and all sorts of communities. So how do our panelists think that we can build greater bonds of solidarity, share resources, and really build allyship in the United States?
Rosie, if I can just jump in there briefly, I think, and going back to the previous question and then responding to this one, the truth is that virtually every system, every entity has been created in the United States, has been created for how well it serves upper class white men. And everything that we're talking about then derives from that. And part of the answer to EK's earlier question about intergroup friction is because as long as the people pulling the strings can keep different people fighting with each other, then they don't look at what's really going on and what is really ultimately behind the issue. So, if we can, fight between religions, and we can fight between racial and ethnic groups, and we can fight between sexualities, then in fact, the people at the top can can continue to do the things they do and you know, perpetuate the same kind of violence that goes on day in and day out against all the groups that we're talking about. And I think the way to, and we do this, I'm also a faculty in the School of Social Welfare, and one of the things that we do is really try to educate all students about, and I know this sounds almost cliched, but the commonalities that we have, and really how in many of our lives, you know, we've been targeted. You know, and as Dr. Fleming said, you know, and she and I have had these discussions. I mean, no one who speaks out goes unscathed. I mean, you pay a price, you know, regardless of who you are. But the more that we can speak out on behalf of each other, I mean, there's in history there's not one social movement that was successful without the support of others, and so we need to, in this case, allow the AAPI community and the AAPI voices to lead the way. But we all have to stand in solidarity and say that, you know, we will not accept more and more of the same, and that it really is time for a reckoning at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robbins. We are running out of time, but we do have something that we want to discuss real quickly. So we're going to direct our questions to some of our faculty members and our students. So I'm going to direct my next question to Dr. Mimura. I'm interested in knowing what you think about some ways that we can raise awareness against racism on campus. Your microphone, yeah.
Thank you. I think we also have to take I mean, also as a historian, a kind of a broader global view of this. And I think a lot of this is Corona, fear of pandemics and natural disasters is one thing, but a lot of these racial discrimination and backlashes have to do with feelings of economic security. And I think that in a global economy like today, it's becoming worse, actually. So a lot of the anti-Asian is right now, it's primarily focused on China, but all Asians are, put in one category. So they all China is the superpower. And it's the first time it's a real superpower that's an Asian country, and a lot of Western countries have to wrap their heads around that. Japan in the 80s was also a superpower. That was the height of Japan bashing. Vincent Chin, his head was smashed open because the auto workers thought that he was Japanese, but he wasn't. So this is happening again, but on a much more bigger scale, because China is much bigger than Japan and has many more ambitions. So to kind of understand where this fear comes from, because a lot of this anger is always rooted in fear, and to really start there and understand what's the source of this fear. I think it would help to ground it in that kind of conversation.
Thank you. Rosie?
Thank you, Janis. So we'd like to ask a question directly to our student speakers, Judy and Khadija Saad. How do you envision, or how would you like us the whole campus community to support students on campus, minority students, AAPI students, and how can students as a whole particularly support AAPI students during this time?
Let's go, yeah, Judy.
Okay, so for me personally, I think the best way for Stony Brook University to support their AAPI students right now would be to just keep in mind about the toll this is taking on our students right now. I think a lot of students kind of have the slight pressure to kind of inform our peers, like go to social media and like share resources and have these conversations at home with our family and with our peers. And so we're kind of taking on a lot like privately. But on top of that, we have to maintain being a student. And so I think that definitely places a lot of pressure on us. And I think some of the best ways would be to maybe have like a space for AAPI students, not just like our clubs, but I know for like CAPS or other mental health resources, I think maybe having like AAPI identifying faculty members that can help us and give us information and like kind of a place for just like that break, because some of us kind of need that break and that rest time because we don't have it when we're not being a student. Even at home, we still have to do more work. And so I think having that place where we can rest and just like have other people who understand the things that we're going through, I think that would be really important for the AAPI community right now.
Yeah, just to add on, I think like from the perspective of an ally and as like a student leader, I think what our student clubs should try to do, or what our like smaller interfaith communities and all the other smaller communities that we have, we should take time to self-reflect within our personal groups on what our personal biases are. Everybody comes with like their own personal perceptions, biases, hesitations, everything. And sometimes we don't recognize those. And maybe perhaps even without recognizing or meaning to, we are harmful against other communities. So I think that somehow kind of opening dialogue within or encouraging smaller communities to discuss with each other or have GBMs or to have group meetings where we have more informed students or more confident students kind of speak on how can we kind of talk about our own personal biases, and then talk about how can we then not kind of like act on those personal biases, or how can we check ourselves.
Thank you, Judy and Khadija. I'm personally very moved by what you guys said. Judy, your idea of faculty mentorship and providing a space for AAPI students to, like you said, be yourselves. And Khadija, your idea of self-reflection within smaller communities, I think is beautiful and I think very much needed.
So we'd like to thank all the panelists for your time, for sharing all this different diverse ideas. It really shows the kind of solidarity based on specific historical context. It's not something that we say we all stand together, but we all stand together by learning about each other. I think that's extremely, extremely valuable. So I thank you all again. I can't say enough thank you. So thank you. I'm giving time back to Agnes, our MC.
Thank you to the panel. It is now time for open discussion, which will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Hee-Jong Song, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Asian American Studies, and myself. So this is an opportunity for us to share experiences, insights, and aspirations. What kinds of things that are necessary for us to do in order to support the AAPI community and to make our campus and our community a better place, and also to improve our AAPI-related academic programs. So you may raise your electronic hands, or if you prefer, you could type your questions and comments and send them to Eva Nagase. Our time is limited, but we will use the time available to hear from as many people as possible. So.
Yeah, it's been really amazing to listen to all our speakers, panelists who even touch upon their own stories and present such a rich issues and topics related to AAPI community. Now we do have some comments in our chat box, and most of them actually are asking very practical questions. How can we reach out AAPI community? Where can we get information to learn more about the history of AAPI community? Is there educational curriculums that we can utilize to educate ourselves more? So these questions are really relevant. and legitimate, at this very point. So if anybody among panelists who would like to maybe suggest a couple of books related to the AAPI history, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, or anyone in the audience.
I don't want to be hogging the conversation, but I do have a list of information and resources from our library. Dr. Janet Clarke from the library has shared a whole list of resources that library put together. I'm going to have them put on the Asian American Studies departmental website. You can all access that once it's up there. She has generously said that we can share that on our website. So that will be a place to start.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. One of the audience who actually left kind of long comment, I think I have to recognize this comment. Suji Huang actually wrote kind of long comment. She identified herself as a BIPOC member, Black, Indigenous people of color member, and also Asian American woman. Among many things she said, I would like to directly quote, I feel that having active bystanders that can intervene would help many, if not all, these situations. These are very helpful actions in of the moment and perhaps for the longer term. So she's urging allyship amongst all people of colors together. So fight this crisis together. So I think that's really, really critical. And she's also urging for the student curriculum, universal student curriculum, that we can learn about anti-racism, compassion, compassion building, and the race and privilege awareness. Because we are a university, higher academic institution, I think it is very urgent topic that we have to tackle. We have to build our curriculum to provide more rich educational opportunities about AAPI history and racism.
All right.
Let's see if we have anybody who has a hand up.
I'm searching for electronic hands.
Okay, I see Mei Peng. Would you like to unmute yourself and put your, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Mai Feng. First off, I want to thank everyone and the panelists for your input today. I definitely learned so much about, and really having that language, right, about talking about these topics, because as you know, it's very prevalent. And excuse the background noise, I'm in Eastside Dining right now. But with all that being said, I want to preface with stating that I am an Asian American woman that was brought up in a community that was actually predominantly Black and Latinx. That's something that I've been sort of navigating through in my undergrad. What does that mean for me? What does that mean as an ally for my peers? And what does that mean to be as an ally for my own Asian American peers, right? With that being said, I've been really fortunate enough to be put in a place where I've had to be very self-aware and self-conscious of how my own actions can affect those around me and those that are within my own community. So I think a question that I have for the panelists is, how do you begin that conversation of self-awareness for one's actions and how that might implicate those around you? Because I think it is one part to educate others, but it is another to know what you're being educated on. So thank you.
Yeah, again, related to education, any panelists who would like to jump in?
I can just say something brief that might speak in a way to the comments that have come up. I think it's really important that, while I certainly agree with the points that, if we have enthusiastic, informed, passionate students and faculty who want to say something and who want to be educators, that's fantastic. But there's also this phenomenon of expecting the same people to speak up and to be the ones to have the energy to say something in a moment where something disturbing or ignorant happens. And part of allyship and active allyship is taking over those periods where other activists and passionate people might be tired and might just be burned out and feeling like they are always expected to be a spokesperson of sorts. And there's this phenomenon in music called staggered breathing, where when one singer gets tired, another one fills that space. And so I think interpersonally, having the emotional intelligence and perception of those around you when you feel like the whole room is turning to one person to try to explain a phenomenon or how they feel or what their experience has been, make sure to perceive if they are just not in the position themselves that day or that moment to be that educator, that you can try the best you can to either call out the fact that they're being unfairly expected in the moment to say something and that might not have the energy and, you know, have been through, you know, a psychic toll with everything they've had to go through, and to try to fill in as best you can. And again, that takes education on your own time, as well as interacting with the great resources we have at Stony Brook, whether documents or books or faculty.
Thank you so much.
All right. Hee-John, I'm afraid our time is up. So
right. We do have several links and the book titles in our chat box recommended by our panelists and the audience. I think we should share the list of information and resources we collected, maybe through email after this event. We are going to reach out to everybody with that information. Yes, I think this is very critical, you know, racial moment in the U.S. history, and our effort and today's meeting, I think, will be remembered. This is a way for us to make the history to come and to shape. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Before we leave, we have a hand, Cheryl Chambers from the Office of Multicultural Affairs.
Yes, just very briefly, I just wanted to add and remind everyone that here on campus, as the president had mentioned, you know, we are all we're committed to creating and maintaining an inclusive campus community where, you know, Stony Brook students, faculty, and staff can learn and thrive in an environment that's free from forms of discrimination. But should discrimination occur on our campus, that there are processes and ways of addressing those issues, and be that primarily through the Office of Equity and Access. But prior to that, I mean, all of us as faculty and staff, whether we are, you know, in a department or in an office or wherever we may be, we have the collective responsibility of supporting members of our communities who may experience discrimination on this campus, and in doing so, reporting so that situations can be investigated, and that anyone who was a victim of discrimination of any type, but, you know, in this context, certainly racial discrimination, but that individuals can seek support and care, and a process that will, you know, look into these situations, and have, you know, potentially the appropriate actions and consequences and stuff. So I just want to let especially our students who are here know that all of us, we're in this together, and that there is a support network, and it really begins with, you know, any of the faculty and staff who are here. We're here to support and to help in those situations. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for this important piece of information and for your support. We also have some very important comments and suggestions in the chat box as well. But in deference to our time limit and to everybody's schedule, we must conclude the event now, but we will save all the questions and comments as well as list of references and share the resources with all the attendees afterwards. Today's event is just a beginning. If you have further questions and comments, please feel free to email them to any of the co-hosts, or you can email to me, agnes.he@stonybrook.edu. So again, we thank everyone for your participation today. We thank the faculty and students panelists, our university leaders. Our campus and community are strong because of our diversity that is built on embracing, understanding, and enjoying the differences among us. So we look forward to a time when the AAPI community, and as well as all other minority groups, will be known in the fullness of who we are and be treated with justice and fairness. And today's event is a firm step toward that goal. So thank you everyone again. Let's stay safe, stay strong, and goodbye.